data supports, and some of this is even DEA data, that below 1%, there's no intoxicating potential for THC. The Congressional Research Service said that 1% is the threshold that some botanical experts consider to have an intoxicating potential or psychotropic effect.
That's Shawn Hauser, partner at Vicente Sederberg, one of the country's top cannabis law firms. And this is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Herlock, and today I'll talk with Shawn Hauser about the arbitrary nature of the 0.3% THC limit in hemp and why raising it to 1% is the right thing to do for farmers and regulators and everybody involved. And then we'll check in with Pennsylvania hemp farmer Ben Davies to hear how his season went and why he's on the fence about Autoflower for next year. But first, I want to tell you some more about the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit, which, if you've been listening to the show for the past few weeks, you know is coming up soon. It's in just a few weeks. It's on December 8th and 9th. And I'm proud to say that Lancaster Farming Newspaper is the media partner for the event. It's 2 full days of panel discussions and industry experts and a chance for the community to come together. Whether you're a farmer or a business owner or an investor, there's something here for everybody. Agronomy and best practices, emerging technologies, hemp as an animal feed. It's a great opportunity to learn from industry experts. I like to say here that cannabis loves community, and here is the perfect chance to connect with the hemp community in Pennsylvania. So it's the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit. Learn more about it at pahempsummit.com. It's on December 8th and 9th. There are registration discounts for Pennsylvania hemp permit holders and students. And also on the registration page, you can sign up for a discounted subscription to Lancaster Farming Newspaper. I hope to see you there. Again, learn more about it at pahempsummit.com. All right, let's get on with our show. So a few weeks ago, I was scrolling through the news on the internet, and I came across an opinion piece on Hemp Industry Daily called "After the Election, Let's Focus on Fixing the Arbitrary THC Standard in Hemp." And it was written by my guest today, Shawn Hauser from Vicente Sederberg, a law firm in Denver, Colorado. Shawn Hauser, welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Could you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Shawn Hauser. I'm an attorney and chair of the Hemp and Cannabinoids practice group at the Vicente Sederberg LLP law firm. And our law firm has been focused in cannabis law for the past decade and specialize in legal services for both cannabis and hemp businesses. But my part of the practice is specifically hemp.
Okay. And you are in Denver? Is that where you're based?
Yes. Our headquarters is in Denver. We have offices all over the country, and right now we are mostly virtual.
Right. Yep. Okay. Well, a few weeks ago, you published an opinion piece on Hemp Industry Daily, and it was called "After the Election, Let's Focus on Fixing the Arbitrary THC Standard in Hemp." So here we are after the election. And so it was a great piece. And in there, you say that the THC limit for hemp, the 0.3% Delta 9 measured on a dry weight basis, is a glaring, unworkable legal standard. Can you unpack that a bit for us? Like, what makes that THC limit so glaringly unworkable?
What makes it so unworkable is the rules that try and regulate around it, because the difference between what is now a legal agricultural crop and a illegal drug is, a tenth of percentage point of THC. And with the USDA rules and therefore most state rules having testing, sampling, standard of measurement provisions regulated around that standard, there's so much opportunity for crop loss and even in some cases, civil or criminal penalties for going hot, that it makes it very difficult not only for farmers to have a successful crop and to avoid crop loss, but to plan to operate in what is supposed to be a regulatory regime that is for an agricultural crop. And the standard that the 0.3 standard, which US is certainly not the only one in this standard, and others have followed, is just arbitrary. And my personal opinion is that effective policy is based in, data-driven, scientific rationale. And so I think, as we've seen very quickly, once played out in practice, with these first few years of legal hemp production, this really isn't workable. And you can see it in the market. You hear it from farmers. You're hearing it from state regulators. Very loud and clearly in these comment periods. And I think what we've seen in the comments to the final rule are, pleased to sort of adjust these provisions that USDA is in some ways stuck with because of the THC standard. And so if we're able to, address the standard itself, we might be addressing sort of the root cause of many of our problems.
Right. And so, like, the industry as a whole seems to think that you raise it to 1%, you're going to eliminate most of the issues, right?
Yeah, I think it would eliminate many of the issues, and it would give farmers, the right space to be able to deal with the weather and genetics and the time it takes to harvest, and still not have, risk of having an intoxicating crop or diversion. And prior to the 2018 Farm Bill, where states like Colorado and others had some leeway in testing, there was no issue. And I think, there's a lot of utility in the 2014 Farm Bill experiments where states had more leniency in, allowing for remediation or alternative testing. It showed that there's not some issue with having this hemp in the 0.3 to 1% realm, being grown. And in fact, that actually is probably appropriate.
Yeah. So you write that Colorado estimates that if the USDA were to allow producers to use hemp between 0.3% and 1% in the supply chain, that $789 million in direct farm gate value and $1.1 billion in total economic output would be preserved. That just seems like a huge amount of money. Is that money being wasted now or left on the table, or like where is that?
I mean, I think that money is being left on the table, and taken away from what should be a promising and very profitable industry, instead creating an industry of farmers who have to take a calculated, pretty significant risk in deciding to grow hemp when there's a chance they're going to lose their entire crop and not be able to fulfill their contract. And to be clear, that number actually came from the Colorado Department of Agriculture's comment to the interim final rule. And, they, cite the issues with many issues, but with 0.3% not being able to have remediation, and say that, if they were permitted to keep that hemp between 0.3 and 1, like you said, about $789 million in direct farm gate value and $1.1 billion in total economic output would be preserved. And their point is too that there should be other methods of, remediation or uses for hemp that is above the legal limit, whatever that is. So we should be able to use that hemp for legal research, for R&D. We should be able to use that hemp to go into an industrial product that is never going to enter the supply chain for consumption. There's so much money to be saved, but and if that's Colorado's number, what does that mean for a state like Texas or Florida? And what is that number nationally?
Right. So you mentioned that the 0.3% limit is arbitrary. Where does that come from? Like, do you know the history of that number?
Yeah, so it comes from an article by a Canadian researcher who was just, admittedly, he uses the word arbitrarily. You picked that standard for his research, and it was in a 1976 paper. And his name was, I believe, Ernest Small. And he's come out and said, yeah, this number was arbitrary. I certainly, didn't intend it to be a legal standard. And he's even said himself, that he thinks that designation has negative implications for the industry and for biodiversity. I think he said it was problematic for those who, are trying to breed certain cultivars. Many cultivars are going to have excess of that THC content, and some of these are the type of cultivars that are going to be, incredibly valuable to our industry. And he, like I said, it's like in his paper, we arbitrarily adopt this standard. I mean, it's just kind of unbelievable. And it was a Netherlands scientific journal called The Practical and Natural Taxonomy for Cannabis.
All right. So what's the difference between 0.3% and 1%? And I don't mean that as a math problem. I know that it's 0.7%, but like is there any like real noticeable difference in like psychoactive effect between 0.3% and 1%?
Yeah, so data supports, and some of this is even DEA data, that below 1%, there's no intoxicating potential for THC. The Congressional Research Service, which referenced, I think, botanical sources, said that 1% is the threshold that some botanical experts consider to have an intoxicating potential or psychotropic effect. DEA's agency guidance deems THC test inconclusive if below 1%. And, even when you look at, and I mentioned this in the article, the NIDA, potency monitoring project at the University of Mississippi, the average potency of marijuana has never been below 2%. And, even going back to the 70s. And when you look at potency of, marijuana in the regulated system, it's often in the teens. 1% is just not considered by scientists and based on data to be intoxicating.
You said about the DEA, like their testing below 1% is what again?
The DEA that has agency guidance that says that a THC test is inconclusive if it's below 1%. So if it's below 1%,
so why would they be in like invited in to monitor the testing agencies in the hemp program if they can't even handle anything below 1%? That's not a question for you. I guess it's just like a frustrating question.
They can. Yeah, I mean, the issue is that the legal standard got set at 0.3, and, then they are tasked with enforcing marijuana laws, and marijuana is now defined at above 0.3. So, I guess to be seen how they, enforce, if anything.
In your opinion piece, you write about learning lessons from alcohol prohibition. What should we be learning? Like, what mistakes should we be avoiding, and what's the deal with 3.2% beer?
Yeah, so the point I was trying to make with 3.2% beer was that was really an arbitrary standard, and in the broader, vein of repealing alcohol prohibition was kind of this baby step that, was politically viable. When you look at it from a macro level, it just didn't work out in practice, and it was in fact very problematic because it resulted in this very difficult patchwork of state alcohol regulations. And the same thing is really playing out in hemp. We have this arbitrary standard. It's more politically viable than full cannabis legalization for many, and so many states are jumping onto it. And now we're seeing, especially in the absence of FDA regulations, states take different approaches to how they address the THC content under their criminal laws, under their food and drug laws, under their hemp laws, and it's a mess, and it's incredibly challenging for businesses to navigate, and it's unlikely to be, operable long term. So let's learn the lesson now and change it, while we're in our first few years of legalization here, rather than, create an untenable environment for businesses for so long. I think the other thing was, they they based it on what they understood to be non-intoxicating. There's some similar kind of rationale for what was 3.2 beer. And then, later, eventually, they understood how to measure it better, and alcohol is measured by volume rather than by just an arbitrary percentage point. So, one of the other issues to address with hemp is that, when we refer to percentages, we need to be explaining how that applies to finished products and, not just biomass.
Right. So a change in the THC limit can only be made by Congress, right? So what sorts of lobbying efforts are underway now?
Yeah, so the next farm bill, really isn't till 2023. So, that's one opportunity, but obviously that is far away. There's other, efforts to lobby Congress here. Courtney Moran with Agricultural Hemp Solutions has launched a campaign called the Crossroads Campaign, which is, starting now, educating Congress members on this issue, trying to get legislation passed before, this next farm bill, and at least setting the table for that farm bill in the worst case scenario to get it up to 1% THC. And, Courtney and Agricultural Hemp Solutions have been integral in the passage of hemp the both farm bills and in state hemp regulations as well, and just I think are equipped to really move this forward. So that's the most significant campaign that I'm aware of. I know Vote Hemp has advocated for 1%, as have other stakeholders. But as far as a lobbying effort, the Agricultural Hemp Solutions Crossroads campaign, I think, is the most robust effort.
Okay. What can, hemp farmers do to sort of move this along? Is there anything that just people can do on an individual level?
Yeah, I think, supporting the Crossroads campaign is really important. And even if it's, not financially, it's having businesses talking to their, state representatives, their state departments of ag, to put that message forward, explaining how problematic this really is in practice. There's just so much education that needs to happen with our elected officials, that because hemp has been under prohibition for so many years. So it takes some time for people to really understand this issue. So I think engaging in this campaign, or in supporting its message even through education is critical, and it's something everyone can do. And, if we can, get our state departments of ag and state officials engaged on this, that can flow upstream and we can get it done. It's still, we only legalized hemp in 2018. There's still a tremendous amount of confusion about it. Congressional representatives are, starting to understand cannabis reform and all the issues, but they get confused. They need to be informed. And I think on these issues where they're hearing directly from farmers and the direct economic impacts, it goes a long way.
Last week, I spoke to Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor, and as you may know, he's on this campaign to bring legal recreational cannabis to Pennsylvania. Is there any reason to think that legal weed would somehow hurt the hemp industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, some that feel like cannabis or hemp progress could be impeded by the push for legalization, and that, hemp products are not psychoactive and, not intended to be used as drugs, and that when they're associated with, cannabis, that, things get confused. There's certainly competition for some of these products amongst the hemp and cannabis industry, especially when you get into, some of the cannabinoid products and who should be selling them and, all those things. But, ultimately, I think that we have to look at the whole plant, and these industries are both supporting each other and bringing each other along. I mean, it's actually pretty historically significant that cannabis regulation really proceeded earlier than hemp did. I mean, we had state cannabis programs and, robustly regulated state cannabis regimes before hemp, even though it was the less intoxicating substance. And it was that progress in cannabis and that engagement by the industry and lawmakers that kind of helped bring hemp along, and some of that research. And then now, because hemp's federally legal, that we're engaging FDA and federal agencies and getting states like Kentucky familiar with the plant. Like, hemp is going to bring cannabis up and empower it. So I think we really do have to look at the plan as a whole, and I think the more we do that, the better our system is going to be. And when we try and break apart hemp and cannabis and the different constituents of it, it becomes very difficult to regulate. And obviously, I think the best policy is legalizing the whole plant and regulating it appropriately. And when we try and criminalize parts of it, it gets very difficult in practice. But I think folks should understand that too. What FDA does here with CBD and other cannabinoids may very well set the table for how cannabis is ultimately regulated when it's federally legal. And so what happens here with hemp is very important. And I think it would be to the benefit of the industry if there was more engagement and collaboration between hemp and marijuana businesses, because we're talking about the plan, and it's been under prohibition for so many decades that the more the more knowledge we have is power. Not to sound like a cliche, but we need to all be communicating, those of us who are learning about the plan and doing this research and trying to inform the best policy.
Right. Do you think we'll see some kind of movement on the FDA side anytime soon?
I don't expect that we'd see any movement, in the rest of this year, which is probably not a surprise. But my hope is that, with the new administration and less interim appointments and obviously the progress FDA has made so far, that we will see some progress. FDA has not been shy about being clear that it's going to take them years to develop a regulatory framework on their end. So I think that process is still going to take a few more years. I do think we can expect a risk-based enforcement policy in the near future. I think it's certainly possible Congress takes action before FDA does, and perhaps the threat that'll push FDA along. But they've continuously said they do not have the information they need to make their decision as to regulatory approach yet. And we're 2 years now after legalizing hemp, so it's very frustrating.
What else should people be thinking about or concerned about when it comes to the THC limit?
No, I mean, something that's interesting, I think, and relevant to these conversations is that the UN is considering the WHO's recommendations to reform the international treaties governing cannabis. One of those recommendations is a footnote that would clarify that CBD that is 0.2% and below is exempt from international control. It's a very complicated topic, but the long and short of it is that whether or not CBD is under control of the treaties as currently written is a subject of most debate. It's my opinion that it's not. It's not independently scheduled. And there's an exemption from cannabis control for cannabis grown for industrial purposes. I don't believe CBD meets the liability for abuse and profile of substances that warrant control. But others take the position that CBD is a extract and tincture of cannabis. It is not exempt under the industrial exemption, and something we need to address. So that's part of the reason we see so much disparity in the international realm. And as we're considering this 1% issue in the US, so are other countries. I think Ecuador was the latest country to adopt cannabis legislation. They just released regulations this week, and they're looking at 1%. And we're seeing more countries go with 1%. But if we could have some clarity on the international level, right, that would really be impactful for the U.S. and other countries. And the UN's going to vote in November on this and a number of other recommendations. So
okay, so we'll wait and see on that.
Yeah.
What other countries are at 1%?
So some of the other countries that are at 1% are Switzerland and Australia. I mentioned Ecuador. And I think there's a number of other Latin American countries that are considering 1%.
Okay. Very interesting stuff. Shawn Hauser, I appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us on our podcast.
Thanks so much.
That's Shawn Hauser, cannabis attorney at Vicente Sederberg in Denver, Colorado. I will have a link to her opinion piece about the THC limit in hemp on the show page for this episode at lancasterfarming.com. Also, you heard her talk about Ernest Small, the Canadian researcher who is credited for coming up with the arbitrary 0.3% limit. I found a great interview with him on the internet, and I will also put a link to that on the show page for this episode. Okay, moving on. We're going to do one of my farmer check-in calls. We're going to get back in touch with Ben Davies. He's been on the show a few times before. I just wanted to hear how things are going up his way at Wildfox Provisions. Hey, Ben Davies, welcome back to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. How you doing?
Thanks. Doing pretty well here. Enjoying a beautiful sunny Pennsylvania fall day.
Yeah, there's nothing like a fall day in Pennsylvania. Anyway, so I, in the past, have done farmer check-in calls, and I haven't done one in a while, so I thought we'd check in with you and see how, your season went and just see how things are going up there at Wildfox Provisions.
Yeah, sure. I think it's good that you do the farmer check-ins, because something that I feel like has been weighing on me this year and this season, and with all of the even just the talk of like legalization of rec cannabis, and so many of these conversations are like things that happen in the void, it feels like. And I feel like it's really important to empower farmers to like give their perspective and to weigh in on what all of this stuff looks like in real time, like on the ground.
Yeah.
I think it's super important to give farmers a voice in that sense. Whereas, there's not, that's where it starts. We're talking about growing plants here. So.
Right. Well, how was your season? How was the growing of the plants?
Well, we had a good season.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was our third season growing hemp, and we grew a little bit less acreage this year than we did last year. We only grew 5 acres. We had grown 7 acres in 2019. And we grew a bunch of the same genetics as we had grown previously. We did trial a few new genetics. So, we're always trying to basically figure out which ones are going to work in our soil and our climate and with our disease pressure and things like that. And so I feel like we're getting some good information there, right, and figuring some of those things out and starting to see the difference between what good genetics look like and what, your run of the mill, just kind of like fly by night kind of genetics look like.
So those successful genetics, what were some of the varieties?
So the ones, basically anything coming from Oregon CBD seeds is pretty solid. We trialed a bunch of their genetics over the years and that's what we've mostly leaned on for the largest scale of our production. Mm-hmm. And as far as like the right timing of maturity in our season, in an average Pennsylvania season, those genetics are finishing the end of September, beginning of October, and they're not really going any later than that unless you planted them really late. Mm. And that's pretty much like the most ideal time frame. Like, you really don't want to be harvesting plants the end of October, let alone into November, which, oftentimes you see a lot of Colorado genetics finishing super late. So those have been pretty solid for us. And we didn't really grow any this year, but the Bubba Kush genetic that a bunch of people grew last year from Sovereign Fields Farm is pretty much right on par with that. Pretty consistent genetic. And then we've probably grown about 30 different, if listeners don't know, but we're focused only on craft hemp as far as cannabinoid production. We're not doing anything when it comes to fiber or seed production. Right. So all what we're talking about here is basically cannabinoid production. So we grew some CBG genetics this year, which was, I think there was quite a few Pennsylvania growers that were trialing those this year. And so far, it sounds like it went pretty well for everyone. The majority of them were growing the white CBG from Oregon CBD seeds, although there was a couple other varieties that were in the mix. And in my mind, from what we saw from our own growing, that really nothing else is worth bothering with, because some of the other genetics were pretty inconsistent and had some much more problems in the field. They were much more susceptible to problems in the field.
Okay.
And I'm not associated with Oregon CBD seeds at all. I just feel like it's important, since right now this industry is not normalized in the way that like buying lettuce seeds is or something. Right, so there's not a clearinghouse of high quality genetics that, a company is putting together a seed catalog from all these different seed producers in this industry yet. And so pretty much every year I see farmers growing this genetic or that genetic because this person recommended it or that person. And it's just kind of like, over time you want consistency as a farmer and you want quality. And so I think it's important for successful genetics to be held in the spotlight, because what we want is for farmers to succeed.
Yeah, definitely.
Research institutions can do more of that research and should be disseminating that information to the farming community, in my opinion. And farmers should not have to do that. We should just be able to know these are genetics that are going to work well, and then we can just grow a good crop.
Right. It's got to be really just super stressful to like have seeds like, well, I don't know what they're going to do, but I'm going to spend a lot of money on them and see what happens. So yeah, you need consistency in your genetics. Right. What other kind of challenges did this year throw at you?
One thing is we trialed some Autoflower Genetics in the spring, and we basically did like 3 successions of those and just failed miserably every time, which I'm sure is not unfamiliar to some farms in Pennsylvania, at least, that have trialed, or nationally that have worked with Autoflower Genetics. They're just a little bit more difficult, and you need a lot of finesse to succeed with them. I think that the seed companies who are producing them know that and are working really hard to guide growers. Mm-hmm. Because as anyone who grows vegetables would know, like it's way more enticing to be able to grow multiple successions and spread out your planting and harvest season over the course of time, instead of having to just plant one giant crop and have this huge high cost, high labor investment all at one point in the season. So I think there's a lot of potential there for the farming community with the Autoflower Genetics.
Okay.
But that was kind of a failure for us.
Will you grow auto next year, or are you done?
I think there's definitely a part of me that wants to say we're done, but I think that, we probably won't ever be done growing autoflower, because we want to hone that skill. Sure. and be able to have that ability to have multiple harvests throughout the season, and even take advantage of some of the higher crop value, which occurs more in the summertime leading up to the main fall harvest season. And so there's some incentive there financially as well. And
that's like a supply and demand thing. Just the supply is lower before the end of the season harvest.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Well, what else? I saw your name on the list of speakers for the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit. That's in a couple of weeks. What are you going to be talking about there?
Yeah. I'm helping moderate a panel that is going to be talking about basically exploring the idea of the fact that we have, a lot of new farmers entering the space, and the hemp crop in particular presents a really unique scenario for the agricultural community nationally, in that there is potential for some higher value crop there, which is enticing. Obviously, the plant itself, being that it's the cannabis plant, is enticing. And then just the fact that it's an excuse for people to kind of live out their dreams of, starting a farm production, an agricultural production, but us knowing just how tumultuous that industry is.
Sure.
I think that there's some extremely unique opportunities there for us to be able to bring new farmers into the fold. And so things like that, I think, are really unique, and we want to kind of explore those topics. And how do we empower those people to diversify their businesses? How do we empower those people to run good businesses in the first place? Because just because you want to be a farmer and you might know how to grow things doesn't mean that you know how to run a good business. So there's a lot of elements there that are extremely valuable, and I think it's kind of like figuring out how we retain those new agriculturalists in the community.
Right. I like when people say that hemp is the gateway crop.
It's not inherently the gateway crop, but I guess you're kind of giving a nod to it being like cannabis being the gateway drug. I never realized that before, but that's
the joke. I mean, that's what they always say. And that's been disproven, that cannabis is not a gateway drug from what I've read. Cigarettes, tobacco is. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Totally. Well, that's cool. That's great that you're going to be moderating a panel. I guess the last time you were on the show, you and Chet Lapp were talking about your work on the steering committee, like the farmer outreach program. How has that been going? Yeah.
It's been going. There's been a flurry of activity, you could say. We originally wanted to start to create some lines of communication. So we set up an email address, a phone number, kind of hotline, Google phone number hotline. And then we obviously, put out the word through you and Like Is There Farming. And that kind of ended up, we hadn't expected that this is what we would be doing, but it kind of ended up with a flurry of activity leading up to harvest season, where we were having an inquiry with the Department of Ag, getting some feedback from farmers who had grown Autoflower Genetics and some who were getting failed crops because they were testing too high on THC, and just having to navigate some of that, and some of just like the new parameters that happen. The Department of Ag is really busy, and they're trying really hard to create a good program. I think and I can see where they would be like, well, this is really important. We need to get this out now. So, they're talking about putting out the parameters sometime around the new year for 2021. And we're, excited about that, but that usually happens. And then later in the season, some more information that was not part of, or maybe just wasn't fully detailed in the original rules and regs for the season. And then it always comes as a surprise to the agricultural community. And so they're like, whoa, wait, now we have to do this for testing. We have to do this for sampling. We have to do this for compliance. And so sometimes those things, like I said, come as a surprise. And that's kind of what happened again this year. And so we were all trying to scramble to figure out how to navigate the testing and the sampling protocol. They developed a certification process so that anyone who is not directly affiliated with a hemp business could become a certified sampling agent. Right. And then you would just basically contact one of them, request for them to come out to do the sampling on your farm, and then that would get submitted directly to the Department of Ag. And so leading up to that, and right around that same time, we were just communicating with farmers who were the farming community at large in Pennsylvania was just very tense and very worried. So we started to talk to the Department of Ag to find out if there was any changes that could be made before harvest season, because there are quite a few things that we see as problematic from an agricultural side, and from a processing side, that up until then we had never been consulted by the Department of Ag. No one representing the farming community at large had ever been consulted directly for how the program would be shaped. As far as like a farmer who was actually growing the crop. Obviously that may have happened, but we weren't aware of it. So we were trying to use our relationship with the Department of Ag on the steering committee to try and have some conversations, which we did, a couple conversations with the Department of Ag, highlighting some of the things that we feel like are problematic. We weren't able to get any of the changes made leading up to the harvest season, but we have had some continued calls with the Department of Ag, advocating for farmers, advocating for processors, and being able to try and, hopefully being able to try and get some of the 2021 rules and regs for the program changed slightly to allow for farmers specifically to be able to have, be able to harvest a high quality crop that's valuable and can be marketed, competitively on the national level.
So do you anticipate fewer surprises for the 2021 season because of the involvement of the steering committee?
I think that we probably could anticipate a few less surprises, but there's always, the Department of Ag's always working, and you never know what they're going to come up with. And so we were privy to some of what the proposed 2021 parameters might look like. So we made comments on those and gave them some guidance. So hopefully they will heed some of that guidance, and we can, create a little bit better hemp program, which I have no doubt the program will be better.
Good.
That, as we move forward every season.
Right.
So yeah, it's hard to know.
Okay. So last week I interviewed Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman. Did you listen to that?
I did give that a listen. Definitely, obviously excited about anything cannabis plant related. So it's very exciting to watch some of what's going on here in the Mid-Atlantic Northeast region with, Pennsylvania talking about legalization of recreational marijuana, and New Jersey and New York, and I believe maybe Delaware too. That's obviously not hemp, but it just feels like the cannabis plant in general is coming out into the light, and just all of those things help to educate consumers and educate the public about, what the healing benefits are of the plant. Right. And I have never had a conversation with Fetterman. I have never seen him on any of the, I don't know if he was on any of the steering committee calls that we had. I'm encouraged to hear the passion. I'm encouraged to hear him making some very bold statements, which, a lot of other politicians may not be willing to make. And that's really great to see someone boldly leading us forward into, a new horizon, and but putting it in practical terms based on this could really benefit the state financially. I think there's definitely always some tension between the hemp industry and the cannabis industry, and they're not always really very friendly towards each other potentially. And so I'm really, I hear him saying things like, this is for farmers, we want to help farmers, we're an agricultural state. Okay, so let's I would say for the listeners to keep a very keen ear to what actually happens, because I feel like if that's the case, then we ought to be giving farmers and even specifically hemp producers, first dibs on some of those kind of things. If we're allowed to grow a new plant in the state, we ought to be able to have preferential treatment because we're the ones who've been learning how to grow this plant, and also being the case that I don't know that everyone is excited about the prospect of recreational cannabis as well.
Right.
But in general, I think hemp is gaining some momentum, and we really want to see like more folks like him directly involved in the program and bringing that passion to the conversations and bringing that like future optimism to the table.
You mentioned sort of like a tension between the different sides of the cannabis industry, that hemp farmers and marijuana folks don't always get along. What's the nature of that tension?
It's not necessarily inherent and across the board, but there's I think that a lot of folks in the hemp industry don't want marijuana associated with hemp, because of the stigma that comes along with that, and just because of the general, like it could be definitely detrimental to the hemp industry for it to be associated with what is otherwise seen as like a drug or a drug industry. And so I think there's a little bit of caution from hemp producers. But I also see it as, it's as plain as day in the hemp rules and regs in Pennsylvania that medical marijuana producers get preferential treatment in the state. We are not allowed to grow hemp within 3 miles of a medical marijuana producer. And that is, I don't know how else you could make it more clear than that, basically.
Right. Are dispensaries in Pennsylvania allowed to sell hemp, like CBD hemp, in their stores?
They are not. Not at this point.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
It could be a valuable piece of that, to be able to, we can produce CBD, CBG, other cannabinoids at a much lower cost than the medical producers can. And so, it could be to their benefit for them, and also the benefit of Pennsylvania hemp farmers to be able to sell some into that industry. That's starting to happen in a bunch of other states across the country, where the medical or the marijuana industry are able to buy in products from the hemp industry, and that could be that again is something that I would love to see. We'd love to see that happen in Pennsylvania, because let's be honest, a lot of Pennsylvania hemp producers are struggling to monetize the opportunity, and on the same token, the Pennsylvania medical marijuana producers are struggling to meet the demand, and they're not even anywhere coming close to meeting the demand for cannabinoids like CBD or CBG in the medical industry. So it only makes sense to bridge that gap at some point.
What else should we talk about? What else is on your mind?
Yeah, I feel like we're spending a lot of time talking about marijuana here.
Well, yeah.
It's definitely like on people's radar here. So
Right.
It's hard not to think about it. But I think that in general, we've had a good, I think in general, the hemp season this year has been a little bit more low key than it was in 2019.
Do you think the pandemic had something to do with that?
Possibly.
It sort of made the whole world a little more low key this year.
Yeah, just a little more quiet on the home front, kind of. There's a lot of really good startups in Pennsylvania, a lot of groups that are starting to use Pennsylvania grown hemp products for their product lines. There's a lot of hemp businesses or hemp growers that are starting to make their own products now and get those products out on the market. We attended the PA Canna Fest a couple of weeks ago, and I was actually surprised to see how many Pennsylvania grown or Pennsylvania based CBD companies or hemp companies, anywhere from like your hemp pretzels to your hemp oils to CBD products. And that's pretty cool to start to see that.
Yeah.
I think we need to continue to highlight some of those businesses and give them their time in the spotlight.
Yeah.
It's definitely true with some of the retailers that we work with, that some of those retailers are starting to go through a phase of purging their shelves of some of the like nationally distributed brands and turning more local to more locally produced brands.
Right. Good.
Because at the end of the day, our products are just as the same quality and same efficacy, if not better, than your like Charlotte's Web, your CV Sciences, and
much smaller carbon footprint too.
Yeah, I mean, those guys were first to the table, and they had their time, but it's time to bring it local now, and we're happy to be engaging in relationships with a lot of retailers and right now, and it's just exciting to see the customer base turn local and really support local hemp businesses as well. So I think that's going to be the big challenge here moving forward, is to continue to develop those supply chains for Pennsylvania grown.
All right, keeping it local with Ben Davies, Wildfox Provisions. Thanksgiving is tomorrow? Today's Wednesday.
Right?
No. Did you raise the turkey? Are you going to have a turkey? Like what's it like on your farm on Thanksgiving?
Yeah, we don't raise turkeys. We we've been so busy with harvest season that we haven't really made big plans, and then obviously because of COVID, we're not really seeing family much. So I don't think we're having a turkey. We're not cooking it. And we don't raise turkeys here. We raise, pigs and sheep and vegetables and things like that. So we're always contributing lots of veggies.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, I hope you have a good holiday, regardless of what you're eating and who you're eating it with. Say hello to your wife, Cara. And thanks again for your time.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Okay, that's Ben Davies from Wildfox Provisions, and like we were talking about, he will also be moderating a panel at the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit. That's on December 8th and 9th. You can learn more at pahempsummit.com. All right, so that does it for me. My name is Eric Herlock. I am the digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper. You can always get in touch with me at podcast@lancasterfarming.com. And be sure to tune in next week, because I'll have some exciting news from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture about next year's hemp program. All right, well, happy Thanksgiving, and until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper.
Industrial hemp.
Episode 110 of the Lancaster Farming Newspaper is copyright 2020 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, which is part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show is written and recorded, edited and produced by yours truly, Eric Herlock. Any music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.